Well, our big focus, the Prime Minister's touchdown in Singapore. Well, Prime Minister Modi is in a bilateral meeting with his Singapore counterpart, Lawrence Wong. This visit, as we've been covering, is expected to see the two sides making efforts to boost cooperation in areas like advanced manufacturing, maritime connectivity, aviation, skills, as well as healthcare. Now, as per reports, among the big key takeaways will be an MOU for cooperation in the semiconductor sector, in which Singapore is a global leader. And Singapore, as you know, has been a long-term investor in India. In fact, since 2000 till now, we have an accumulative FDI of 160 billion US dollars. Here are the details.
After 6 years, Prime Minister Narendra Modi is visiting Singapore at the invitation of his Singaporean counterpart, Lawrence Wong.
Prime Minister is visiting Singapore after nearly 6 years. In fact, his last visit to Singapore was in his first term as Prime Minister, and an early visit during his third term is something that is particularly welcomed by the Singaporean side. And also this is at the time when a new leader in Singapore, in His Excellency Prime Minister Lawrence Wong, has just taken over, and this is an opportune time to set the stage for the next stage of our vibrant bilateral relationship.
The visit comes a week after the second round of India-Singapore Ministerial Roundtable held in Singapore. The Indian delegation included Finance Minister Nirmala Sitharaman, Foreign Minister Dr. S. Jaishankar, Commerce Minister Mr. Piyush Goyal, and Information and Broadcasting Minister Ashwini Vaishnav. The meet reviewed progress of key bilateral issues and identified advanced manufacturing and connectivity as thrust areas. As India's sixth largest trade partner and largest source of FDI, PM's visit is expected to push the pedal on bilateral trade.
Singapore is India's sixth largest trade partner worldwide and the largest source of FDI during the last financial year. Investments have also been very large. Since 2000 till now, we have had cumulative FDI of about 160 billion US dollars.
One area of interest or congruence between the two countries is semiconductors, and Singapore has a wide range of expertise in manufacture, fabricating, or even producing semiconductors in its region. And India will be expecting a deeper and serious cooperation with Singapore in this domain.
India has deep strategic and commercial interests in Singapore. There are over 9,000 Indian companies registered in Singapore. 80% of listed offshore bonds by Indian issuers are listed on Singapore Stock Exchange. In February 2023, India's UPI and Singapore's PayNow connected for speedier remittances between the two nations. The visit comes as India is countering Chinese influence in its maritime domain by pushing ahead its Act East policy. As New Delhi continues to build on its role as a major player in the Indo-Pacific, these visits will pave the way for deeper strategic and trade collaboration between India and the entire ASEAN region. Mohammad Ghazali for NDTV.
And joining us for further clarity, my colleague Mohammad Ghazali, also with us on the broadcast, Dr. Jonah Blank, Senior Political Scientist. We will just go across to Dr. Blank. Ghazali, as we know, the Singapore agenda, well, MOUs are on the radar. We hear that MOUs will be signed for cooperation in manpower skilling in the semiconductor sector. So from skilling centers to training and recruitment by Singapore firms will all be catered to?
Yes, certainly. This particular visit of Prime Minister is focused on bringing out something new from this partnership between India and Singapore when it comes to the semiconductor technology. We know, as you rightly mentioned, and the report also said that how Singapore is known as one of the pioneer nations in the world when it comes to semiconductor technology. India is looking for a deeper and a serious cooperation with Singapore. So India will also provide its own manpower for training and skilling. And there will be a better coordination with Singapore when it comes to semiconductor technology. We will have to see that what will be the contours of those MOU, which will be signed today. But semiconductor remains the main focus of the government, because besides semiconductor, we already have defense cooperation with Singapore. We have trade ties, as you rightly mentioned, that in the last financial year, Singapore was the largest source of our FDI. So when it comes to trade, manufacturing, defense, these ties are already there. But this semiconductor technology is one thing which will be, which is one key area of focus. The officials here in the External Affairs Ministry have hinted it before the Prime Minister embarked on this 3-day visit to Singapore and Brunei. And in Singapore today, Prime Minister is also going to meet CEOs of different Singapore's companies, and also a meeting with the Prime Minister, his counterpart, where the bilateral talks and all these MOUs will be signed.
As always, Ghazali, thanks so much for joining us with the latest update. Let's also rope in Dr. Blank, who's also a senior research fellow at the National University of Singapore. Thanks so much, Dr. Blank, for making time for us on the World 24/7. Is the Prime Minister's touchdown in Singapore, our Prime Minister's touchdown in Singapore, right after a few hours in Brunei, on ground zero, is it being perceived as one with a goal to play a bigger role in the region where China has a major influence?
Well, this is definitely seen as something that is in line with Singapore's own goals for the region, and it's been 6 years since India has come. From a Singaporean perspective, that's quite a long time.
Right.
I think one of the big questions is, for the semiconductor deal, from a Singaporean perspective, where are the semiconductors going to be produced? Because Singapore wants not simply to invest in India's industry in this regard, it wants to actually build its own semiconductor industry.
Right, but we also know, meanwhile, that the visit comes shortly after Mr. Lawrence Wong assumed office as the new Prime Minister of Singapore. Dr. Blank, how does the government in Singapore view Narendra Modi as the leader of the world's largest democracy?
Well, Singapore very much wants to have closer ties with India. Singapore is already a very close security partner with India, and this is a part of the discussion that both countries want to solidify but keep a little bit out of the public eye. So I think it's pretty safe to assume that there were a lot of security discussions behind closed doors that were not really broadcast as much to the general public.
We're also hearing that some Singaporean sovereign wealth funds are planning to expand their portfolio in India. In fact, certain reports highlight that Temasek is reportedly looking to invest about $10 billion in India over the next few years. Any credible word on that yet, Dr. Blank?
Well, as your report has so rightly pointed out, Singapore is already the 6th largest trading partner of India, and last year was the largest source of foreign direct investment. From a Singaporean perspective, there's a constant hunger to find new investment opportunities in the region. Traditionally, Singapore has focused a lot of that in Southeast Asia, and I think a lot of Singapore investment would really like to expand that into India.
In fact, you know, Dr. Blank, some people argue that if there was ever a study in contrast between two nations, India and Singapore would probably be great contenders, because on size, on population, GDP per capita, even landmass, both countries are poles apart, and yet the history of both our countries has been one of sustained mutual respect and also trying to carve out a unique space for themselves, especially in a multipolar world. Do you share the same assessment?
Yes, it's true. On the surface, they really would seem to have very little in common. In fact, having lived in both countries, I can say there are a lot of similarities in the area that both are multi-ethnic, multi-religious, multicultural nations in their very core. You can't really take out the different strands in either nation. Neither nation would be what it was if it were not a tapestry.
Well, thank you so much, sir, for joining us with your thoughts. We will, of course, revert to you for regular updates while Prime Minister Modi has touched down in Singapore.
For having.
With that, let's turn our attention now to the United States, where 2 students and 2 teachers were actually killed in a mass shooting at a high school in Georgia. The suspect, a 14-year-old student at the high school, was questioned by law enforcement even last year regarding anonymous tips about online threats to commit a school shooting. This is according to a joint statement from the FBI and Jackson County Sheriff's Office. The subject denied making the threats online, the agencies have said, but the suspect is currently in custody. This is the 14-year-old suspect. And this shooting, unfortunately, is at least the 45th school shooting in 2024. It comes less than a month since classes resumed as the United States continues to struggle to bring a gun violence epidemic under control.
So before I begin, I do want to say a few words about this tragic shooting that took place this morning in Winder, Georgia. We're still gathering information about what happened, but we know that there were multiple fatalities and injuries. And, you know, our hearts are with all the students, the teachers, and their families, of course. And we are grateful to the first responders and the law enforcement that were on the scene. But this is just a senseless tragedy on top of so many senseless tragedies. And it's just outrageous that every day in our country, in the United States of America, that parents have to send their children to school worried about whether or not their child will come home alive. It's senseless. It is. We've got to stop it.
Well, the US has seen hundreds of shootings inside schools and colleges in the past 2 decades, as we have been reporting. In fact, the Gun Violence Archive reported there had been 384 mass shootings in the US this year, before Wednesday's incident in Georgia, and more than 11,500 killed by gunshots, excluding suicide. In fact, the group considers a mass shooting to be one in which 4 or more victims are killed or shot, not including the shooter. Tony Waterman joins us with the latest from Ground Zero.
The investigation is still very much in the early stages, but what we know so far is that 2 students and 2 teachers at the Appalachia High School in Winder, Georgia, were killed on Wednesday. Officials say another 9 people were taken to local hospitals with various injuries. A suspect is in custody, a 14-year-old male student at the school. The county sheriff says he has been interviewed, but at this point, no motive has been released. Officials added that they're not aware of any connection between the suspected shooter and the victims. The director of the Georgia Bureau of Investigation says the suspect will be charged with murder and tried as an adult, which means he could face the death penalty. This shooting at the high school, which is located about an hour outside of Atlanta, started just after 10 a.m. local time Wednesday. Police arrived within minutes and say once confronted, the suspect surrendered immediately. Now, as you'd imagine, there's been an outpouring of grief over this incident. Kamala Harris, the Democratic nominee for president, calling it a senseless tragedy. Former President Donald Trump saying our hearts are with the victims and their loved ones, while President Joe Biden reiterated calls for stronger gun laws. According to the Gun Violence Archive, there has been 385 mass shootings in the U.S. so far this year, 45 of those happening at schools, yet lawmakers have done nothing to advance legislation to make it harder for people to access firearms. Now, Appalachia High School is going to remain closed for the remainder of the week as the investigation continues and the community tries to pick up the pieces. Tony Waterman, NDTV, Austin.
Welcome back. Ukraine is undergoing its largest government shake-up since Russia invaded the country in 2022. As the war reaches a critical juncture and President Zelensky prepares to visit the United States to unveil a victory plan on how Kyiv hopes to win Ukraine's entire battle with Russia. In fact, I must inform you that Dmytro Kuleba, Ukraine's foreign minister, has resigned as part of a wide-ranging government reshuffle designed to give what Zelensky has called new strength to the embattled country. But Zelensky's US visit later this month comes as Ukraine is preparing for various scenarios ahead of the presidential election in November in the US that could affect the future of a key partnership that has until now ensured Ukraine's defense. Joining us for a quick comment, geopolitical analyst and national security attorney Irina Sukuman. Thanks so much, Irina, for making time for us. Take us through the significance of Zelensky reshuffling his cabinet at a key moment in the war and ahead of his trip to the United States.
The reshuffle was expected. It's been in the works for a very long time. Kuleba is actually one of 6 ministers and senior officials who have tendered their resignation, and the parliament actually declined 2 of these resignations, keeping those officials in place. Kuleba's own resignation will be voted on by the parliament tomorrow. There is some difference in tone over the reasons for this reshuffle. The government spokespeople describe it as an interest in putting in more energy into the new cabinet, particularly before the expected trip to the United States.
Right.
Others claim that the cabinet in its current form has been ineffective, in particularly in dealing with the latest challenges on the military front, with some of the Ukrainian troops surrounded in Pokrovsk. Regardless, most of these officials, including Kuleba, are expected to remain active in the government, and Kuleba is going to be addressing Ukraine's relations with NATO in his future position.
Well, Irina Sukuman, thank you so much for joining us with that quick comment. The Ukrainian president has not given any specific reason for this reshuffle, but it was on the radar. It has not been dealt as a surprise. It is a key moment for Ukraine in the war, and all eyes are on Zelensky's entire visit to the United States later this month. Well, thank you for investing your time and watching this edition of The World 24/7. We'll keep tracking the latest developments for you. Do stay tuned.